In the early morning hours of September 1st, 1939, German air and ground forces advanced across the border with Poland, thus marking the beginning of the Second World War. 2 days later, the people of Britain listened anxiously as Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain spoke to the nation and announced England's declaration of war against Germany.
At this time, we transfer you to London for an important announcement by the British Prime Minister.
Up to the very last, it would have been quite possible to have arranged a peaceful and honorable settlement between Germany and Poland, but Hitler would not have it.
10 months later, as Hitler's generals prepared for an invasion of the British Isles, the German Luftwaffe began its campaign to destroy the Royal Air Force and gain air superiority over the English Channel. The heroic defense mounted by the RAF came to be known as the Battle of Britain. From July through October of 1940, men and machines fought to the death in the skies above England until withering German losses caused Hitler to cancel the invasion plans. On the other side of the Atlantic, most people in the United States preferred to think that they could simply isolate themselves from world events. With the memories of World War I and the Great Depression still fresh in their minds, the thought of new foreign entanglements frightened most Americans. Still, President Franklin Roosevelt could see the war clouds gathering and began gearing up America's industrial might for what he knew was the inevitable conflict to come. The call to military service was also being sounded, and recruitment posters began appearing everywhere. Although there was great fear of a coming war with Germany, the ranks of the Army and Navy began to swell with new recruits. Among those who watched these earth-shattering events unfold were the students at Bloomfield High School in Bloomfield, New Jersey. In particular was a sophomore named Henry Wida.
Well, before the war started in 1939, there had been expectations of a European war for many years. Some people generally believed that Hitler would eventually start a war, so few were surprised when Germany invaded Poland.
Hank Wida was born in Atlantic City, New Jersey on February 15, 1924. The oldest of 5 children born to Henry and Anna Wida, Hank discovered his love for aviation at a very early age.
Well, I think I was always interested in aviation. I think that's because where we lived in New Jersey, we had a golf course behind our house, and airplanes were constantly landing there when they ran out of gasoline or had engine problems. We always took advantage of the opportunity to talk to pilots and see their airplanes.
As Hank and his fellow high school students watched Nazi Germany conquer country after country, he knew the day would come when he would be taking to the skies with the Army Air Corps. He didn't have to wait long. The morning of December 7th, 1941 began like almost every other day in Hawaii, sunny, warm, and peaceful. But just before 8 a.m., the soldiers and sailors stationed on this idyllic paradise were jolted as waves of Japanese planes began attacking Pearl Harbor. An hour and a half later, the attack was over, leaving 18 Navy ships destroyed and over 3,500 Americans dead or wounded. A continent away, it was a chilly winter afternoon in New Jersey.
Well, I remember that it was too cold to caddy at the golf course, so I was home, listening to a football game, when the announcer interrupted to tell us that Pearl Harbor was under attack by the Japanese, and that an undeclared state of war existed between the United States and Japan. Well, after America entered the war, there was a nationwide movement by young men to join the various services and fight our common enemies. Millions of people volunteered to go and fight the war. Industry started tooling up, and the vaunted production capabilities of our industrial society were assembled to provide the tools of war, not only to our military, but also to those of our allies.
Immediately after America declared war on the Axis powers, young men began appearing at recruiting stations in droves. Those who didn't volunteer were subject to the draft, which Roosevelt had signed into law in 1940.
Well, after high school, graduating from high school, I started negotiating with my Army contacts to allow me to join the Army Air Force. We reached agreement, and they told me to appear at Fort Dix in January of 1943. I appeared, and they said all bets were off, since they needed infantrymen for the coming invasion, and they shipped me off to Nashville, Tennessee for basic training. Well, shortly after arriving at Nashville, I saw a building with an Air Force sign on it. I went in and explained my problem, and they said, "Sign here." I did, and they said, "You are now in the Army Air Force." I took some tests and was sent to both Bombardier and Gunnery School.
Once Hank had secured his transfer to the Army Air Corps, he was put on a train for the trip to Aviation Ground School in Houston, Texas. It was February 1943. As a young aviation cadet, he spent 3 months learning the basics of military aviation. He also spent 3 months in Laredo, learning to be an airplane machine gunner.
Well, I thought both schools were very interesting. At Gunnery School in Laredo, Texas, it was fun learning to shoot a .50 caliber machine gun, as well as taking it apart in a dark room and reassembling it to operating condition. At Bombardier School in Midland, Texas, it was interesting learning how to drop bombs accurately on a target.
Hank's next stop was in Midland, Texas, where he attended bombing school. After 4 months learning the intricacies of precision bombing, Hank graduated with a commission as a second lieutenant. After a short leave to visit his family, Hank found himself assigned to the newly formed 467th Bomb Group based in Wendover, Utah.
This was the most godforsaken base we had ever seen, more than 100 miles due west of Salt Lake City at the California-Nevada border. Population 100, maybe. Cold, desolate, windy, muddy, lived in cold concert huts, terrible living conditions. We were all happy when it was time to move on to our next base.
After 4 grueling months of intense training, the 467th was ready to make its way to Europe. During his training, Hank had learned to truly appreciate the B-24 Liberator.
Well, at Wichita, Kansas, we got our final bomb group inspection from the Air Force, so we were free to depart the United States, which we did at 11 p.m. on February 15, 1944, my 20th birthday. Well, the B-24 was first conceived in 1939, 4.5 years after the B-17, to meet the Air Force requirements for a second heavy bomber. The B-24 carried a heavier bomb load. It was also faster and had a much longer range than the B-17. It had a crew of 10, and its maximum speed was 303 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. It was capable of carrying a bomb load of 5,000 pounds, a distance of 1,700 miles at 25,000 feet. Each aircraft carried 10 .50 caliber machine guns for defense.
For American airmen heading to Europe, the route was long and complex. From Utah to Kansas, to Florida to Trinidad, and then on to Brazil for the transatlantic crossing to Africa.
Well, the only thing we could see along the way were the forests of Brazil, which were every bit as dense as I would expect a forest to be. Also, I'd never before or since encountered as much clear air turbulence as we did over these forests. Well, after leaving Brazil, we had a very boring flight across the South Atlantic to Dakar in West Africa. A few days later, we departed for Marrakesh. This was our final stop before flying to the last leg of our trip to our new base in England near Rackheath, which is near Norwich.
After all 58 aircraft of the 467th arrived at Rackheath, near the city of Norwich in northeast England, the crews began to settle into their new homes.
At Rockies, we were assigned to various Nissan huts. Nothing very elaborate, but adequate, with a big coal-burning pot-belly stove to heat the building. There were 8 officers from 2 flight crews assigned to each hut. Our base had just been completed the week before we arrived, so it was brand new. Interestingly enough, during the nighttime we could hear things dropping on the steel roof. We soon learned that it was the fragments from the anti-aircraft guns of Norwich that were defending the city from attack by German bombers. We used to go out in the morning and pick up the fragments that slid to the ground from the roof.
Despite the months of intense preparation, the 467th still was not approved for operations.
Before we could fly our first combat mission, we had to learn the procedure for operating aircraft so we could take off and land without hitting each other. This was very important since the weather in England was always very cloudy, so you couldn't see other nearby aircraft. During the flight assembly process for a mission, for example, we would follow around a radio beacon while climbing to altitude through cloud cover that was often 3 to 4 miles thick. Well, we also learned how to fly really close together in formation. This enabled us to concentrate our guns on an attacking aircraft. The German Air Force pilots soon learned to find targets that did not fly in tight formations. Our group leader understood this and had us flying tight formations all the time.
Finally, on April 10, 1944, the 467th Bomb Group was ready. Their first combat mission was to bomb an aircraft production plant in the French city of Bourget.
A flight crew briefing was held at 6 a.m. in the morning. Since this was our first mission, we didn't know what to expect. As we approached the continent, we were extra alert. We flew deep into France, past the city of Paris, where we could see the Eiffel Tower, and onto the target, where we bombed successfully. We encountered no flak, and all planes arrived back at base without any problems. Thank goodness.
During the next 2.5 months, Hank and his crew completed the required 30 missions in one of the shortest time periods of the war. In just 78 days, Hank bombed targets in France, Germany, and Belgium. On every trip, Hank's bombardier position in the nose gun turret of the B-24 gave him a front row seat to the battle that raged around him.
Well, it was interesting to see the difference in the number of airplanes that went to a specific target. When attacking a small, lightly defended target, 100 airplanes were enough. And you could look around and see most of the airplanes. However, for well-defended targets such as Berlin, 1,000 or more planes were usually sent in a line of aircraft, stretching over 100 miles or so. We were always alert with these large formations, since the Germans would surely send fighters up to intercept us as soon as possible. They went after those groups first, who were not flying close together before their bombs were dropped. While this was going on, the anti-aircraft guns were firing at the aircraft in the lead as they entered the target area. The aircraft that were first over the target were in the safest position because the Germans had not determined the precise altitude at which they were flying. If you were tail end Charlie, the altitude that had been established and the aircraft loss rate was higher.
In the days leading up to the D-Day invasion of Normandy, an important target for the 467th was the launch sites for the German V-1 rockets. These terror weapons were hurled at England from both fixed and mobile launchers in France, Holland, and Belgium.
While we were there, Hitler launched the first of his secret weapons. This was the V-1, a large flying bomb with wings and a crude timing system to control an internal combustion engine. They were launched from various locations on the continent with a timed flight. When the time was up, the engine cut off, and the bomb hit whatever happened to be in its way. As they flew over our base, we were not concerned, as long as we could hear the engine running. When it stopped, everyone ran for cover.
The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, was the biggest amphibious assault ever mounted, with 160,000 Allied troops entering France from the sea and another 24,000 by parachute airdrop. The role of the 8th Air Force on D-Day was to soften up the German defenses and to bomb roads and rail lines in order to disrupt enemy counterattacks and reinforcements.
Well, we bombed at dawn, and it was very difficult to see the target. But as we headed back to our base over the continent, I had a bird's eye view of the tremendous Allied invasion forces in the English Channel on their way to France. Thousands of boats. Fortunately, we encountered little flak and no fighter opposition. A week later, we were sent on what was to become a memorable mission, where we attacked a bridge and successfully destroyed it from an altitude of just 6,500 feet.
Despite the tension and fear of aerial combat, most air crews decorated their planes with creative and, well, sometimes humorous nose art. Sadly, many of the 487's missions claimed at least one aircraft lost to flak or fighters. As the end of June of 1944 neared, Hank's crew got the mission they'd been waiting for: Berlin.
The raid on Berlin on June 21st, 1944 was the only Berlin mission that I participated in. From many points of view, this was our most important mission. We were attacking the heart of the German war machine, and we knew there would be a lot of opposition, and there was. Our target was the rail yard in the city. On the way to Berlin, we flew past the fuel storage tanks in Hamburg, which we had bombed 10 days earlier. They were still burning, and the smoke from these fires reached our altitude. As we approached the city, the flak guns started going after the aircraft miles in front of us. By the time we were over the target, the air was filled with smoke, and our squadron started receiving heavy flak damage to some aircraft. There were also some German fighters aloft. I saw them considering whether to attack our group, but they went after other aircrafts that were flying in looser patterns. We flew back to our base successfully.
The bombing of Berlin was Hank's 26th mission. During the next week, he would fly 4 more, completing the coveted 30th mission on June 28th with a raid on the railroad yards at Saarbrücken, Germany.
Well, the real meaning of 30 missions completed was that the war was really over for us, and they would be sending us back to the United States for reassignment. However, before doing this, they had an award ceremony, which we were each awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and an air medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, as well as a promotion to first lieutenant in my case. They sent me to Scotland to get on the Queen Elizabeth first for the trip back to the United States. We arrived in New York City on July 15th, 1944, exactly 5 months to the day that we left for Florida. I then went home for a 2-week leave, followed by 30 days rest and recreation in Atlantic City, New Jersey. I was then assigned to Clovis, New Mexico Air Base as a bombardier trainer, but that was boring. I was bored training bombardier students, so I requested and received a transfer to a B-29 group in Tucson that was heading for Japan. So we attended many ground school classes to educate us about the aircraft and flew many flights to acquaint us with how the aircraft operated. We had almost completed our training when the war ended. Shortly after the announcement, I was discharged.
After World War II ended, Hank stayed in the reserve until the 1950s, finishing up his Air Force career as a captain. Today, Hank reflects back proudly on his service to his country and on the warriors he flew with.
Well, after the war, there was no need for all the B-24s and all the other aircraft. Most of them were simply melted down. A very few survive today, and for me, it is something I always look for when one of the old warbirds comes to town.
Though time has taken its toll on the men and machines who fought the battles of the skies, there's still great interest in preserving these memories for future generations. The Collings Foundation of Stowe, Massachusetts is a nonprofit educational foundation that acquires, restores, and preserves military aircraft from the First World War through today. Hank has been an active supporter of the Collings Foundation and never misses a chance to see the Foundation's B-24 Liberator when it visits a local airport on one of its annual nationwide tours. In the hectic pace of our modern lives, it's hard to find time for simple reflection. To pause long enough to consider the time and space in which we exist, and to quietly ponder the monumental events that have shaped our nation and our world. Sadly, our memories of World War II are fading so quickly now. The greatest conflict in the history of mankind is confined now to textbooks, the occasional movie, and the recollections of the survivors who are still with us. We must never be allowed to forget the enormous sacrifices that average Americans made during the war, both at home and on the battlefield.
One thing I learned early in my career was that rank has its privileges, and a second lieutenant, which I was, had none. We all trained as a crew in the United States, and when it's time to fly overseas, we were all supposed to go together. Or a captain who was not going to fly, who was not a flyer, decided he wanted to take my place instead. And he was able to take my place because he outranked me, which left me having to take the boat. I didn't want to take the boat because I wanted to see South America and Africa. So I found out they had a list of stray people like myself. So I got on the list, and I was selected to fly with Colonel Shower, who was our group commanding officer. And all of his senior officers, the lowest rank of which was a major. So here's a second lieutenant flying to Europe with all this rank. It turned out they were pretty decent people, and one day I asked them why they picked me when they could have had a lot of other people. And they said that the reason they picked me was because I had been a Boy Scout, and we were going to be flying over the jungles of Brazil for a couple of days. And if we had any problems, I might be able to help them out of the problems if we had a crash. So I found it to be an interesting commentary on the Boy Scouts and what people thought of Boy Scouts in those days. Most people I know have the same characteristics when they walk. You cannot distinguish one from the other. But there are certain people who, for whatever reason, develop certain gait characteristics, which you can recognize at a distance. When we were flying down to South America through Trinidad, we stopped in Trinidad. I was going up to the control tower for some reason. I looked out and I saw this guy about 200 yards away. I recognized the gait. And I called out, and it was Steve Brody. Steve Brody was the caddy master at the Glen Ridge Country Club, where I used to caddy when I was a kid in high school. And we got to know each other pretty well. And I recognized his gait when I ran into him during the war from the control tower. I said, it must be Steve, and I called, and it was him. So I found it interesting that I was able to tell from a distance without having seen him that it was him. Our base was located on the base. We lived in Quonset huts, which were basically steel huts. 8 officers to a hut. At night we'd go to sleep, and during the night we'd hear these things hitting the roof of the building. We couldn't figure out what was going on. We soon learned that it was the flak from the guns at Norwich who were shooting at the attacking German aircraft, and the flak, which is really the metallic fragments, would just fly all over, and they'd come down and land on our roof. In the morning we'd go out, and they would have slid to the ground, and we'd go pick them all up, take a look at them. On many of the missions to Europe, we would pass Paris many times. And one of the things we all liked to see was the Eiffel Tower. We'd all heard about the Eiffel Tower as being a major structure of the world, but we'd never seen it before. And being able to see it, and even under the conditions we were seeing it, was really a thrill. And no one ever bombed it because it was too much of an architectural masterpiece. On one of their earliest flights over Europe, we flew over Holland to get to Germany. And we came across this big body of water called the Zuider Sea. I remembered that when I was in grammar school, we had learned about the Zuider Sea and the dikes that the Dutch built over there. So it was really something to be able to see something that we had actually learned about in school. So we all liked it. We all liked that. The English climate was noted for it being cloudy most of the time, and it was really due to the soft coal that they used to burn all the time. So the problem that this created was when you take 1,000 planes and put them in the air, they all have to avoid each other. There has to be a set pattern on how one gets from where you are to where you're supposed to be and form into a group. They had what they called radio beacons, and everyone had their own beacon they followed. And you get on the beacon and climb up in a spiral until you came out on top. And presumably on top you'd find a circus ship, which was a B-24 that was painted garishly, so you could recognize that it was your group, and everyone would form in that group. So one day we're climbing up through this fog to 20,000 feet. And as we come out of this fog, I'm sitting here in the forward gunner's turret. I see a group of 17s coming out of a cloud over here, and another 17 coming out of here. They ran smack into each other. About half a dozen planes either blew up, or everybody jumped out, or didn't jump out. I'm sitting here watching the whole thing with a bird's eye view. Big disaster. Somebody screwed up really bad. As the bombardier, I was one who dropped the bombs on the target. Interestingly enough, we seldom saw where the bombs landed because the airplane flew on and the bombs lagged behind the airplane. However, there is one instance in which I remember the damage we did with our bombs. We were going to Berlin to bomb Berlin. 10 days later, after we had bombed Hamburg, and we had gone after the oil field targets in oil storage areas in Hamburg. And we had hit them, and they were still burning 10 days later. The smoke was up at our altitude, obscuring our vision, and so on. So we really started a lot of big fires. One of the things that Colonel Schauer always insisted upon with the pilots was that they flew tight formations. And he used to emphasize it with practice, practice, and more practice. And this was not just a foible that he had. He knew that if you flew close formation, the German fighter aircraft would let you go by. They'd rather attack a group that was flying loosely. The looser they are, the easier they're to get. So we had very few fighter attacks on us, even over Berlin, where they came and looked us over, but it flew onto somebody else. So we were very lucky from that point of view. The bomb groups that had loose formations had higher losses than we did, as was to be expected. You never knew what target you were going to go to until the morning of the briefing, at which time all the crews would assemble in one building where they had a big map of Europe and with the flight paths in and out marked on it. But they were never unveiled until after the meeting started, so we never knew where we were going until we were well into the briefing. And one morning they pulled back the curtain, and there we were, heading for Berlin. We all thought that was interesting, but we also knew it was full of problems because the Germans were very adamant in trying to beat us off from bombing Berlin. We knew that there would be lots of heavy flak, and when we got there was flak. You could almost walk on it. You've probably seen pictures of the flak fields. And by the time we got there, the Germans were pretty good at picking us off and knocking us out of the air. Also, the ME-109s were up in force that day, and I still remember this guy flying across in front of us, taking a look at us, and saying to himself, "No, I don't want to go after those guys." One of the things that Colonel Schauer insisted upon was that all of the planes fly up close. It made it more difficult for the attacking pilots. So they always liked to go after groups that flew loosely. So one of the great attributes of Colonel Schauer, for example, was being a strict disciplinarian about saying that everybody flew tight formation. But Berlin was a place from which we were all happy to go to, but also happy to escape from. Off the shore of Denmark, 30 miles or so, as I recall, is a German island called Heligoland. This is probably the most bombed place that any of us ever bombed during the war. And what we did was we bombed it with the bombs that hung up in our bomb bay and didn't drop on the target. We would wait until we got them ready to go after leaving the target. So when we flew over Heligoland, we would all drop our SS bombs down there. Even though it had no military value, it was probably the most bombed place on Earth during the war. One of the characteristics of the aircraft engines that were used during World War II, as well as today, as a matter of fact, is that they all have incomplete combustion processes. What that means is that they issue particulates, small black particles called soot. And when you're flying at altitude in an atmosphere with a lot of moisture in it, the moisture condenses around these particles, forming what are called condensation trails, or contrails for short. The Germans used to tell me that, this is after the war, that one of the ways they used to tell how big a mission was going to be was with the number of contrails. If you had 1,000 airplane attack, for example, there were 4,000 contrails, which made them very alert to the fact that they were going to be bombed heavily. With only a few contrails, we had a short number of airplanes. The primary difference between the British RAF operations and the U.S. 8th Air Force operations was that the British operated at night, and we operated during the daylight hours. However, there were times when the troops needed help in France after the early days of the invasion, and they would send us out late in the afternoon. And what that meant is we came back after dark. And when you came back after dark, you had to be careful because the Germans would sneak in fighters along with you. And as you started to land, when you're most vulnerable, they would shoot you down. And one night they attacked our base. They killed a couple of airplanes and a couple of guys. So we were extra alert from then on at night. Well, I have a great many memories of D-Day. I think the one that stands out most in my mind is the one that I have after we had bombed in France early in the morning. As we turned around and flew back towards England, we came to the coast. Dawn was breaking, and to the west of us, we could see the ships, the assault ships, who were coming in with all the troops and equipment. Thousands of them, many thousands, all crossing the channel at one time. We all marveled at the organization that it took to do something like this, but obviously it turned out to be a success, and we won the war. D-Day was June 6, 1944, and on June 11, 5 days later, the Germans were still fighting heavily in northern France and bringing in reinforcements. So one morning we were at crew briefing, and they told us our target was going to be a railroad bridge. And the peculiar thing about this was that we were going to bomb it at 5,800 feet, which we all thought was suicide. Turns out that we had no opposition at all, fortunately. We went over the bridge, we bombed the bridge, and we hit the bridge. And 50 years later, I talked to our engineer on the airplane. He told me he'd watched through the bomb bay doors as our bombs went down. He said they went down and hit the bridge, and the bridge went and caved in. So it was a successful mission, and I had the pictures to prove it. One of the problems we had in flying over Europe was that when you flew over Europe, either direction, you were always over enemy territory. You had no place to land if you had a problem. Except if you were as far enough north, you could go to Sweden, or you were far enough south, you could go to Switzerland, and many people did. One of the problems with people who came back direct to the base was that they would often run out of gas before they got to the channel, and they would either crash or whatever. So one of the first things that after D-Day, the Seabees got busy and started building runways by bulldozing them out of the farmers' fields. And the first airplane to use it was an airplane from our group, Lieutenant Grace, as I recall. And he told us later on that the Seabees were howling at him because he's building the runways and they're trying to land on the runway at the same time. So it all worked out okay. But the Seabees deserve a lot of credit for doing all the work they did. The B-24 generally was a very good airplane. It had good engines on it, and it was generally quite reliable. But when you're in combat, you never know what's going to happen to you. So one day we were flying someplace, I don't remember where, but one of our engines got hit by flak, and we lost an engine. So we're flying on 3 engines, and the B-24 doesn't like to fly on 3 engines. And soon we lost another engine for a reason which I don't remember. So now we're on 2 engines, and we figured, well, we're probably not going to make it. So we're flying over France, and we were able to throw out all our guns and everything that weighed anything to lighten the airplane. And as we kept making, we could see the channel. Across the channel, we could see the White Cliffs of Dover. We figured if we could get that far, we'd be safe. So we flew across the channel in a glide. We got to the White Cliffs of Dover, and we're below the cliffs. But as you approach the cliffs, you get lift out of the wind coming offshore, and it lifts right over the top of the White Cliffs. And we found an airport on the other side and landed there. So it was a safe mission, no trouble after that. Many people have asked me what it was like flying over Europe with being attacked by German aircraft and the flak guns as we go by the cities. I think that what I tell most of them is that there are 2 ways to find out. One is read the book called Masters of the Air, which gives the complete story of the 8th Air Force operations in Europe. And the second is to look at the movie 12 O'Clock High, which came out shortly after the war, which describes missions of bomber crews over Europe. The thing was so popular that it was turned into a TV series. We finished our 30th mission over Europe in late June of 1944. And when you finish your missions, they send you home. So we left our airplane at Rackay, and they took a train to Scotland where we caught the Queen Elizabeth, a major British ocean liner. It took us 5 or 6 days to get home. And we docked in New York at the pier alongside where the Normandy was lying in the mud, where it just burned the week before. In conversation with my good friend Tony Frisco, a Yerbil and the deli owner, we found that he had gotten on the same boat that I had just gotten off of. And he was going to Europe when I was coming home from Europe. So he went to Europe and fought in Italy and elsewhere while I went home. We thought that was an interesting coincidence. We found each other in that respect. Our group used to hold annual reunions, and one of the reunions we had at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, was attended by our former group navigator who had been shot down earlier in one of the early missions of the group. I had not seen him since the war. We sat and talked about what happened during the war. He told me this story about how when he was in the prisoner of war camp, what they would do is, as new prisoners were brought in, they would holler out the name of the group which they were with. So he said one day I hollered out 467th, which was our group, and a young navigator comes over, and I asked him where the rest of his crew is. He said, "You won't believe the story." But he said, I was on the flight deck, and as you know, they're drafty. One of my papers blew down into the wheel well. I went down to the wheel well to get it, and I leaned over to pick it up I had my parachute on. I leaned over to pick it up, and the airplane hit a pocket. And it went up, and I went down. So I inadvertently bailed out of the airplane. Everybody else went on home and left me there. There's nothing they could do. So that's how I'm here all by myself. After returning from Europe and having completed 30 missions, the Air Force assigned me to a bombardier training school in Clovis, New Mexico. After doing that for a while, I was bored to tears. So I said, put me on a B-29 crew and send me to Japan. They obliged to send me to Tucson, where I joined the B-29 crew. We were in training there when the war ended, and that ended that era of my life. But I find it interesting that 60 years later or so, we have B-29 still existing at places like March Air Force Base Museum, which has many, many other types of aircraft. I think it's important that the people of today understand what happened in the past. And places like this should be supported by everybody because they are really history in the making.